I never thought I'd see the day when strangers would walk across my land as if they owned it. But that's exactly what happened. 35 homes, built brick by brick, right on property that legally belonged to me. The HOA called it community growth, but to me it was outright theft. Every morning I'd look out my window and feel the anger boil, watching families move into houses that should never have stood there in the first place. And when I realized I had one powerful option left, I took it. I opened the dam, and what happened next changed everything. Would you have done the same? When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found peace. My land wasn't just property. It was a piece of my family's history. Acres of open ground, bordered by quiet woods on one side and a gentle stream on the other. It was the kind of place where you could wake up to birdsong instead of traffic, where evenings felt calm, and where you could build a life without constant noise pressing in. At first, the community seemed friendly enough. Neighbors waved when they passed. Kids rode their bikes near the cul-de-sac, and the HOA introduced itself as a group dedicated to protecting property values. I didn't think much of it. I figured they were there to make sure lawns didn't get overgrown and maybe to organize a summer barbecue or two. That's what HOAs are supposed to do, right? Life settled into a rhythm. I took care of the land the way my family always had, mowing the fields, maintaining the fences, and checking the dam that helped manage the water from the stream. It was quiet, predictable, and in many ways, exactly what I wanted. But as time passed, little things began to feel off. The HOA sent newsletters that seemed more like rulebooks than updates. Words like community property and shared access started appearing more often. At first, I skimmed past them, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that their focus wasn't just on keeping lawns neat. Neighbors who once waved began asking strange questions. How much of that land do you actually own? Or has the HOA ever discussed development with you? I brushed it off, assuming it was idle curiosity. After all, what could they possibly want from my land? But I was wrong. Very wrong. That little stream running past my property wasn't just a pretty feature. It was a source of control, a hidden leverage point I didn't realize would matter. And soon, I'd learn that the HOA and their partners weren't looking to protect the neighborhood at all. They were preparing to take everything I had built my life around. At first, the signs were small. A letter slipped under my door. A polite note about community standards and the importance of maintaining uniformity. I remember reading it and thinking it had nothing to do with me. My fences were intact, my grass was cut, and my home was in better shape than most on the block. But at the bottom of that letter was one phrase that would soon define everything: shared land usage. I didn't understand it at first, but a week later another letter came. This one wasn't polite. It was official, stamped with the HOA's seal, and it demanded that I cease unauthorized use of community property. My land, my family's land. They were calling it theirs. The first time I read it, I laughed. Surely it was a clerical error. But then the visits began. 2 members of the board showed up, clipboards in hand, acting as though they were conducting an inspection. They walked across my yard without so much as knocking, pointing at my fields and writing notes like they were surveying it for themselves. When I asked them what they were doing, one of them told me flatly, "This section has been designated for community development. It's not really yours anymore." The audacity of it left me speechless. Not mine anymore? I had the deeds, the titles, the history. But as I soon learned, none of that mattered to them. What mattered was power, and the HOA wielded it like a weapon. Letters turned into fines. First, they charged me for unauthorized use of restricted land. Then came a penalty for failure to comply with community planning. The numbers weren't small either. Hundreds of dollars that seemed to multiply with every week I resisted. At neighborhood meetings, I became a target. Board members spoke about me like I was a problem, someone standing in the way of progress. Neighbors who once waved now avoided me, whispering in driveways and pointing as I walked by. Slowly, the community I had trusted was turning against me, poisoned by the HOA's narrative. But the worst was yet to come. One morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. When I stepped outside, I couldn't believe what I saw. Bulldozers, surveyors, crews in bright vests marking the edges of my property. I shouted at them to leave, demanded to see their permits, but all they showed me was a stack of HOA papers claiming the land was part of a planned development project. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was invasion. Within weeks, the outlines of new homes appeared on ground that had been mine. 35 units crammed side by side, each one eating away at what I had worked so hard to preserve. And every time I protested, the HOA countered with more fines, more threats, more letters from lawyers. They claimed I was trespassing on my own land, Imagine that. Walking across the fields I had maintained for years, only to be told I had no right to be there. The pressure was suffocating. I tried to fight back through legal channels, but the HOA had deep pockets and relentless attorneys. Every call to my lawyer drained my savings. Every letter I sent back was answered with a bigger threat. They wanted me exhausted. They wanted me broken, and for a while, I almost was. Nights became sleepless, filled with the constant dread of losing everything. Days were a blur of arguments, paperwork, and the sight of those houses rising where my open fields used to be. The sound of hammers and saws was like a constant reminder that I was being erased, one nail at a time. But in that chaos, I remembered something they didn't. That stream running along the edge of my land wasn't just decoration. It fed into the dam, my dam built decades ago by my family to manage water flow. And as I watched the construction climb higher and higher, something inside me shifted. The HOA had taken my peace, my money, my reputation, but they had overlooked the one thing that tied it all together: the land's natural power. I began quietly checking the dam again. I walked its length, inspecting every gate, every lock, every section of stone and metal. They thought they had beaten me into submission, but they hadn't. They'd pushed me to a point I never thought I'd reach. And as their construction neared completion, with homeowners lining up to sign contracts for houses built on stolen ground, I knew what I had to do. The storm was coming, literally. Weeks of heavy rain had filled the stream to its limits, pressing against the dam with more force than it had seen in years. And there I was, holding the decision that would change everything. Would I let the HOA take the last of my dignity, or would I take back control the only way left? That question haunted me every night as I lay in bed, listening to the storm clouds roll in. I could almost hear the water roaring behind the gates, waiting, building, daring me to make the choice. By the time the last house was finished, by the time families were unpacking boxes and planting flowers in stolen soil, I had made up my mind. The dam would not hold forever, and neither would I. The night it all came to a head, the storm had been raging for hours. Sheets of rain hammered the roof, the kind of downpour that makes the earth feel like it's groaning under the weight of water. I sat by the window, staring out at what used to be my land, now cluttered with 35 freshly built homes. Their lights glowed in the darkness, a glowing reminder of everything I had lost. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear what I heard. Beneath the roar of the storm was another sound. Deep, constant, and powerful. The water pressing harder and harder against the dam. For weeks, I had wrestled with the choice. I tried to fight them in court, but the HOA's lawyers buried me in filings and motions. I tried to rally neighbors, but fear of fines kept them silent. They wanted me gone, erased, forgotten. But what they hadn't realized was that their arrogance had built their entire dream community on top of my family's lifeline. The dam wasn't just stone and steel. It was history. It was leverage. And now, it was the one thing they couldn't control. That night, the HOA president came to my door. Drenched in rain, umbrella snapping in the wind, he had the nerve to tell me I needed to evacuate unauthorized premises. His exact words: "My home unauthorized." He spoke to me like a criminal standing on stolen ground. Something inside me broke. I laughed in his face. The sound startled even me. It was sharp, bitter, like the release of pressure that had been building for months. "You don't get it," I told him. "You've already lost." He frowned, called me delusional, and walked away. But as he stepped back onto the street, clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield. The storm cracked open overhead. A thunderclap shook the ground, and in that instant I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and headed toward the dam. Each step through the mud felt heavier than the last. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. The closer I got, the louder the water roared, thrashing against the gates like a beast desperate to be freed. Standing there in the dark, soaked to the bone, I felt the weight of it all. The letters, the fines, the whispers, the bulldozers tearing into my fields, the humiliation of being called a trespasser on my own land. And above it all, the smug faces of those board members, convinced they could take what they wanted without consequence. This was my moment. My hands shook as I reached for the mechanism. The storm's fury masked every sound, but in my head, everything was deafening. The pounding water, the echoes of their threats, the crack of thunder overhead. I pulled. The gates groaned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a roar like the sky itself splitting open, the water surged forward. It wasn't a trickle. It wasn't a leak. It was a torrent, unleashed with the kind of force that no blueprint, no regulation, no HOA fine could stop. The stream became a river. The river became a flood, and within minutes, it was pouring into the land they had stolen from me. I watched as the water carved through their manicured streets, swallowing sidewalks and creeping up driveways. Lawns became lakes, flower beds vanished under waves, and those brand new houses, those 35 monuments to their arrogance, began to tremble as foundations met the unstoppable truth of nature. Panic erupted. Lights flickered on in every home, silhouettes scrambling in windows. Cars revved, tires spinning in mud as families tried to flee the rising water. Shouts pierced the storm, neighbors calling out, children crying, board members screaming orders that no one could follow. And through it all, I stood there, silent, watching. Not with joy, not even with anger, just with a cold, unshakable sense of justice. They had stolen from me. Now the land itself was taking back what was its own. The HOA president waded into the flood, his umbrella long gone, shouting something I couldn't hear. Maybe he was calling for me, maybe for help, but it didn't matter. His clipboard was useless now, his power meaningless against the force he never bothered to respect. The water rose higher, rushing through the skeleton of their so-called community. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not because I wanted anyone hurt, never that. But because finally the balance had shifted. Finally they understood what it meant to underestimate me. By dawn the storm eased. The rain slowed, the clouds began to break, and the damage was undeniable. Streets washed out, yards destroyed, basements filled to the ceiling. Some homes left unlivable before their families had even settled in. The HOA's grand project, their proud display of control, lay shattered under the weight of water and consequence. And me? I stood at the edge of my land, exhausted, drenched, but unbroken. They had thrown everything at me. Legal threats, public shame, financial ruin, and still in the end, I had the final say. But even as the sun rose, even as I watched the HOA scramble like ants to salvage what they could, I knew this wasn't the end. The real fight was only beginning. There would be investigations. There would be accusations. They would paint me as reckless, dangerous, even criminal. Yet deep down, I knew one thing. No matter what story they spun, no matter what consequences came, the truth had already been written in the mud and the floodwaters. They had built on stolen ground, and stolen ground never holds. When the water finally settled and the storm moved on, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The streets that had once been lined with freshly poured sidewalks were now a twisted mess of mud and debris. Those 35 houses that the HOA had paraded as their crown jewel project stood silent, their pristine exteriors stained with water lines, their foundations cracked and sinking. It was as if nature itself had erased the illusion of permanence they tried to build on what was mine. In the days that followed, chaos reigned. Insurance agents swarmed the neighborhood, scribbling notes with grim faces. Contractors circled like vultures, quoting outrageous sums to repair damages that seemed beyond repair. Families who had moved in with excitement just weeks before now carried soaked boxes back out to moving vans, their dreams literally washed away. And the HOA? They scrambled. Meetings were called in emergency sessions. Though for the first time, their confidence was gone. No polished speeches, no smug smiles, only fear, because the truth was unavoidable. They had gambled everything on taking what wasn't theirs, and now it was all gone. Of course, they pointed fingers. At me, at the storm, at anyone but themselves. They accused me of sabotage, of recklessness, of deliberately causing the flood. Investigators were brought in, and for weeks I lived under the shadow of being branded a criminal. Reporters even showed up at my door, asking for a statement, shoving microphones in my face. But what they didn't count on was history. That dam wasn't some secret weapon I had hidden away. It was a registered, documented piece of infrastructure, built decades before the HOA even existed. My family had maintained it for generations. Records showed that I had consistently inspected it, repaired it, and managed it responsibly. And the heavy rains? They weren't my doing. They were nature's. The storm had been recorded as one of the heaviest in years. All I had done was open the gates at the wrong, or maybe the right time. Legally, there was little they could pin on me. And every lawyer they sent after me quickly realized that pursuing charges risked exposing their own negligence. Because here's the part they wanted to bury. The HOA had built those homes illegally. They hadn't secured the proper land rights, and their development project violated environmental regulations by encroaching too close to the stream. When the investigators dug deeper, the truth came out piece by piece. Misfiled permits, forged signatures, A paper trail of arrogance and shortcuts that exposed just how corrupt the HOA board had become. What they had tried to spin as me being reckless turned into them being criminally negligent. The fallout was brutal. Board members resigned in disgrace. The president, the same man who had stood at my door in the rain, calling me unauthorized, was forced to step down and later faced charges for fraud. The HOA's credibility shattered, and lawsuits piled up from angry homeowners demanding compensation for their ruined houses. And me? I finally had my day in court, but not as a defendant. As the plaintiff, my lawyer filed claims for damages, trespassing, and theft of land. It wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, about forcing them to admit what they had done. After months of hearings and endless arguments, the judge's ruling came down clear. The land was mine. It had always been mine. The HOA had overstepped every boundary and they would pay for it. The compensation wasn't small. Between settlements, restitution, and penalties, I walked away with more than I ever imagined. Enough to rebuild, to restore, and to finally breathe again. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was standing there in that courtroom, hearing the judge declare in no uncertain terms that the HOA had no authority over me, that every letter, every fine, every humiliation they had thrown at me had been nothing but smoke and mirrors. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. But the impact didn't stop there. The story spread beyond our little neighborhood. News outlets picked it up, bloggers wrote about it, and soon my battle with the HOA became a kind of cautionary tale. Messages poured in from strangers across the country, people who had been bullied by their own HOAs, thanking me for standing my ground. They told me I gave them hope, that I had shown them HOAs weren't untouchable. And yet, even in victory, the cost was real. My land would never look the same again. The flood had carved scars into the earth, and it would take years to heal. Some neighbors never forgave me, convinced I had gone too far. Others avoided me entirely, embarrassed by their silence when I needed them most. Still, when I walked my fields, muddy but mine, I felt something stronger than regret. I felt pride, because I hadn't let them erase me. I hadn't let them win. The dam still stands today, a reminder of what happens